That's no problem.
And Emma Goldberg is a prolific writer. She's written for the New York Times and written a book and a number of things along those lines. And I asked her today to come and talk with you about what it's like to communicate in the business world during COVID. So Emma, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and I'm excited to hear a little bit more about the class. It sounds like a really interesting course that you guys are doing. So I guess I thought I'd start just by talking a little bit about how I came to this kind of reporting and how we think about what it means to cover the future of work. Because technically my beat at the Times is called The Future of Work. And it's like a kind of position that the New York Times has not had before. But last year, as businesses were kind of going into upheaval because of the pandemic and people were working from home and companies were trying to decide whether they had to require people to come back to the office, it was just this moment of so much tumultuousness in the business world that the New York Times decided that it would make sense to have a position that was dedicated to covering just the future of work. So all the ways that the working world was changing, both because of COVID, but also because of kind of all the layers of change around COVID. So when you think about it, there was the pandemic, there has been kind of these economic swings in the market. There's been like a shortage of workers. So it's just kind of like crisis on top of crisis. And each one of those has shaken up the way that we work. And a lot of fundamental assumptions about like how we do our jobs and what it even means to like have a relationship between an employee and an employer. So I think when I started out on this kind of reporting, I thought the goal was maybe going to be more like which companies are going back to the office, which are making big changes. Like, for example, Airbnb announced that they are never going to require their workers to go back to the office. And meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, there's Goldman Sachs, which is saying, you have to be in the office 5 days a week. So there's such a wide spectrum. And I thought that the kind of reporting I would be doing would be more like keeping up with what individual companies were doing. But what's been really fun is that it's actually been a lot broader than that. So my editor and I are often identifying kind of larger trends in the business world that we want to cover, that we think readers are kind of thinking about, but not necessarily, firmly getting a handle on. So one example is recently, there's been a lot of talk about whether there's going to be a recession. That's something a lot of people are fearful about. And as a result of that, there's also been some layoffs. So for example, Robinhood did layoffs, Netflix did some layoffs, Goldman had people that didn't keep on. So there's been some layoffs starting, and we started thinking about like, what are the absolute worst ways that companies are doing layoffs, or just kind of the most unusual. So one example that I reported on was there was a company where the CEO had to lay off 2 people. And then he posted a selfie on LinkedIn where you can see that he's crying. And he had this post where he was basically saying like CEOs can be vulnerable too. So I did a piece that was looking at like, what does it mean that now we're all talking about vulnerability in the workplace, and what are kind of the good forms of that and what are the bad forms? So on the one hand, I think what's been positive about the last 2 years is that people have had so many kind of personal hardships, crazy things going on in their personal lives. And so there's a lot more of an expectation that you can bring your whole self to work and show up at work and talk about what's going on in your personal life. On the other hand, you also have instances where like there's CEOs who are crying while they're doing the layoffs, which I think to a lot of people felt kind of inappropriate because, if you're the one doing the layoffs, like, are you the one who gets to cry, or is that for the workers that you're laying off? Is that kind of inappropriate or oversharing? So we basically wrote a piece for the New York Times that was looking at oversharing CEOs and some of the kind of downsides of this new age of like corporate vulnerability. So that's one example of ways that we've written about kind of what's going on in the business world in a less traditional way. Another one that I think Professor Brecht might have shared is around workplaces increasingly trying to measure happiness. So I think traditionally, workers retain, or companies retain workers by giving them raises or free food or like fun programming. But all of a sudden, a lot of companies are also trying to measure how happy their workers are, which also opens a lot of questions like, what does it even mean to be happy? Or, like, can you be happy in your personal life, but unhappy at work? Like, should your work care if you're happy in your personal life? So it kind of opens up this Pandora's box of messy questions. So those are some of the kinds of interesting stories we've gotten to get into recently that are about the future of work, but in ways beyond just like, are we going to be doing work on Zoom? And I think that's maybe where I'll end this like intro is, I think when people think about the future of work, people's minds often jump to like, okay, what software are we going to be using? What computer programs? Like what's going to be automated? But I think it's also so much about like the way we communicate with each other. How much are you allowed to bring emotions into the workplace? What do you wear to the workplace? And what does that signify about what professionalism means right now? How do we think about what it means to be productive? So it's all of these questions that are not just like, what computer software are you using? It's much more kind of human. And so I guess that's where I'll leave off, and then I'll turn it back to you, Professor.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. I ask my students to do some research and come up with questions. And so now let's see if we have some questions from the class. Yes, sir.
I don't know if I'm on the camera, but that's okay. What medias are you paying attention to gather information on the future of business? So like what forms of communication, whether it's social media or what other news articles are you reading to gather more information of what you write about?
Did you hear that?
That's a great question. We pay a lot of attention to like the jobs report from the federal government, which shows like how many jobs are being added to the economy. We pay a lot of attention to this report called JOLTS that also comes out of the government and shows how many people are quitting. Because you guys might have seen a lot of the social media around the Great Resignation. So basically, over the last year, the number of people quitting their jobs has been at a record high. And especially in hospitality, like restaurants, bars, hotels, just a ton of people quitting their jobs. And the federal government releases data that shows month to month exactly how many people are quitting their jobs. And that signifies a lot. That signifies like, are people looking for better jobs? Do they feel like there's a lot of opportunities available to them and therefore they don't need to stay at a job that they don't think is paying them enough? Do they feel like they don't need to work? So the quits rate, which comes out of the government, shows a lot about kind of how people are experiencing the economy. In terms of media, I think the Wall Street Journal does a really great job of covering kind of day in and day out what's going on at various businesses, where there's layoffs happening, like mergers and acquisitions, things like that, which all affect obviously the lives and experiences of workers. I pay a lot of attention to like labor journalism, and there's actually a lot of really great like freelance journalists who cover unions and labor organizations. Like there's a woman named Kim Kelly who has just reported extensively across the US on union drives and just put out a book on that. I read I definitely follow like Twitter, TikTok, because I think those can be really good indicators of just how people are talking about work. So for example, all of the trends around like quiet quitting really came out of social media and out of people doing tweets and TikToks where they were talking about how they were, starting to do a little less at work, maybe not put in 100% because either the pandemic had made them kind of reorient their priorities, or they were just unhappy at work, or they felt like they weren't being treated kind of to the utmost of what they deserved, or they felt like they weren't getting the raises they needed to keep up with inflation. So I think social media can be a really good way to track what are people dissatisfied about, which is, I think, an important question to drive a lot of reporting.
Well, you're a voracious reader and anybody else have questions? Ted?
So like, I'm assuming as a New York Times writer, there's a lot of people that read your articles, and I'm guessing that some people don't agree with them. Like, how do you handle criticism, or like how much criticism do you get being a business writer for the New York Times?
Can you hear that all right?
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely a lot. I get a lot of like kind of angry emails or tweets. More about like I would say it's not always like about articles that I can predict as something that's going to like evoke a lot of frustration or critique. I've had a couple of articles in particular that people got like really mad about. I did an article last March that was about companies that were making their workers take the test of what's your love language. And then they wanted to know what every worker's love language was. So like if a worker's love language was gifts, they had to wear like a badge that said that, and then their coworkers would know to get them gifts. Or if someone's like love language was words of affirmation, then their boss would know to like give them a lot of compliments. And they took out physical touch, which was smart. But I got so much like criticism of that piece. And a lot of people were basically, I think in writing the article, I realized in retrospect that maybe I was just kind of presenting the facts and saying this is happening. And a lot of people felt like this is horrible and stupid and inappropriate. And like, why are you asking people to share their love language instead of just like giving them a raise? So I think people felt like I could have quoted more people who had critical takes of that. And I got like really angry emails, tweets, direct messages. I would say that actually for the most part, whenever that has happened, I've ultimately found like it was difficult, but I'm usually feel like I learn a lot from the criticism I get. So for example, with that article, in rereading it, it made me realize that it would have been probably more helpful to the reader to have more quotes that were expressing skepticism about this whole model of like asking people to show their love language at work. So I took that criticism, and then for the next article I was working on, I kind of actually redid the entire thing and thought about like, how can I step back and offer more of a framing and not just present what's going on. And that was actually the happiness article, where I ended up bringing in a lot more critical voices who don't think that workplaces should be measuring how happy their workers are. So I would say the criticism can sometimes be a lot to take in, just especially when it's more personal. Like people will look up, you know, where I went to high school or like who my family members are, and that feels like weird and inappropriate. But I also have felt like when it's substantive, I learn a lot from it, and I definitely take it to heart for future pieces that I'm working on.
All right, I'll confess, I looked up where you went to high school.
I just went to a Jewish school. I don't know.
A prolific writer as well. I did, you know, you do have a public image. I want to ask you something. I'm an old TV guy, so I'm used to looking into a lens, and I'm used to looking at how people interact using video. And you have impressed me with your presence on Zoom. Did you rehearse? I mean, we've all heard the jokes about wearing your Zoom outfit where you got a nice top, but you've got pajama bottoms on. But did you rehearse? Because you have good hand interactions, good gestures, and very personable. And that's a new form of communicating for a lot of people.
No, that's a great question. I did not rehearse, but I do spend a lot of time on Zoom for interviews. And I think that's been one of the fun parts of covering the workplace right now. Is one of the things we're actually covering is like this weird new world where we're meeting each other virtually. My boss and I were recently talking about like this weird thing that people are sometimes saying to one another right now, where they're like, oh, we've met, but we haven't met in real life. Like, nice to meet you. And we're seeing that going on at the office a little bit. So there's even like a new vocabulary where people have sort of worked together for a year or 2 years entirely on the internet, and suddenly they're meeting in real life. The other thing is I'm not wearing pajamas. I'm at the office. So this is our newsroom, which is not that full today because it's raining.
How do you communicate with your coworkers at the office. Because I did work in the newspaper industry. I worked in television news, but we were always all together except when we were out covering something. And how do you communicate with the editor and with the people you report to or the people that you work with?
We have some meetings. We'll have story meetings where we all kind of sit around and talk about what we're working on and share ideas. So if you have an idea that maybe you're not going to report out, but you want to give to a colleague, you can share it there. Or if people have feedback on one another's story ideas, or sometimes what'll happen is two people will be working on a story that's kind of complementary, stories that are complementary to one another. So maybe someone will be writing about how there's a slowdown in hiring and businesses are having to downsize. And then someone else will be writing about how workers are noticing that there aren't as many job opportunities out there. So those stories are complementary, and it's helpful for people to know what their colleagues are working on and reporting out. And then we'll spend some time just out reporting. So for example, next week I'm going to San Francisco because I'm writing a story about downtown San Francisco office spaces. So I'll be there walking around and meeting people in person. So it actually really looks pretty different day to day and week to week. We're all coming into the office 3 days a week. So on those days we'll have meetings, we'll sit at our desks and make calls and report. And then on the other days, people will either be out going to meetings around the city and, going to businesses, reporting, or they'll be home and writing. So it's definitely every day and week looks really different.
Okay, let me ask you guys, any more questions out there? Right?
All right, so I'm interested in how people dress, or I guess what you think. So, like I'm a basketball player, so I follow the NBA, and like the coaches used to wear a suit and tie, and now they just wear like a quarter zip and whatever. So I'm wondering, to you personally, do you think it makes people look more approachable, or do you think it makes them look less professional? And then like, what do companies say about that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's a coworker of mine did a great story. She covers retail, and she did a great story that talked to all these different clothing companies about like, are people dressing differently post-pandemic, or as we're easing out of the pandemic and as people are going back to the office, what are they wearing? And a lot of clothing companies said that there's this new term that's emerged called power leisure, where it's basically like you're not dressing as nicely as you used to, but you're still in some way dressing like professionally or in some way that communicates power. Whether it's like maybe you're not wearing jeans, but you're also not wearing like kind of stiff slacks, like you're wearing pants that are a little bit looser. Or maybe you're not wearing a tie anymore. And I think that's definitely something a lot of companies have talked about. I think one of the things that they're bringing into conversation about that is a lot of companies feel like they need to do whatever is necessary to get people back to the office. And there's been a lot of fear at companies that if they require people to go back to the office, people who really don't want to go back will just go find a job that doesn't require them to be in person, because there are now like a substantial amount of remote only job openings. So I think some companies have felt like if they're going to require people to come back to the office, they're going to at least ease the dress code a little bit. So it's not like you have to go back to the office, you have to go back to your commute, you have to spend like time and money driving or taking the subway or whatever it is to get to the office, and you have to put on like a tie or high heels. So I think they're saying, you do have to come back to the office, but you don't have to dress as nicely or uncomfortably as you used to. Personally, I think it's like an area where there's going to be interesting studies about how that affects like interactions or kind of standards of professionalism. I think on the one hand, it can maybe make the office a more like approachable and like kind of more communal place. I think some people have really always felt uncomfortable trying to find work clothes that made them like feel like themselves. And I guess on the other hand, I think that, everyone knows the studies about like sometimes if you're going to take a big exam at university, it helps to dress up, or like if you are working on something in your pajamas, maybe like it's just a little harder to like really focus because you feel a little bit like you're like in nap mode or like hanging out with friends mode. So I think that there's going to be sort of an interesting opportunity to look at what effects this has on all of us, that we're changing a little bit the way that we dress, or that we're not as like hard on ourselves as we used to be. The one other thing I'll say is that there's been really interesting research that the people who are more hesitant to go back to the office are often people of color and women. And I think that some of the findings that like researchers have showed is that people have basically, the pandemic has shown people that they never really felt comfortable in the office. Maybe they never felt like totally socially accepted, or they just always felt like they were like kind of performing to these standards that felt really restrictive. And when they've been working at home, they've been able to be much more themselves. And I think part of that is clothing, and wearing clothing that feels comfortable or non-restrictive, or even like high heels are really uncomfortable to people. And if you're more comfortable, maybe you can do better work. So I think that there's also going to be opportunity to kind of, for offices to think about how, when they're bringing people back, how can they make them feel more like they can be comfortable and do their best work.
Well, you really have researched this topic. I have time for one more question. Yes.
Relating to this, do CEOs and like head of businesses now, I guess, like focus on the office space, like how people relate to each other, the relationship and stuff like that?
Did you hear
Yeah,
that?
that's a great question. I think there's actually been a lot of offices that went through renovations and redesigns as they brought people back. I was talking with a colleague about this recently, actually, because you would think that that would all be like for safety, like better ventilation or more distancing. But what I've found is that it's actually more often offices are undergoing redesigns to make themselves more sort of like social spaces. So a lot of offices have introduced like lounges or like kind of comfy seating or places where people can congregate and hang out. And I think the reason is that a lot of offices have felt like if they're going to bring people back, they need to say why. And the main reason that a lot of articulated is that they want people to be able to like connect, collaborate, form relationships with their colleagues. And if that's going to happen, then they need to like redesign the spaces to facilitate that, which often means like more couches, more lounge areas, things like that. I don't know if that answered your question.
I have a question related to that, and then I want to say thanks again for taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It was really good to meet all of you.
Last week, we had the president of a local company, Nelnet. I don't know if you've heard of Nelnet, but it's a fairly large company, has about 6,000 employees. And he made the statement that he figured 75 to 80% of their people would always work remote or in a hybrid kind of a situation. And I've heard you say so far today that some people are being required to come back to the office, and others are saying we're never going to be in the office. Is it too early to tell, or what is your take on where we'll kind of settle on that? Will 50% of the people be hybrid workers, or I'm curious of what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers are pretty interesting because the Labor Department has been gathering data every month on what percent of people are working from home. And at like the very peak of pandemic lockdowns in May 2020, it was 35%. So May 2020, 35% of people were working from home. And this summer, that was down to 7% of the population. So it's a pretty small segment of the US population. That being said, something that researchers have pointed out is that Labor Department data kind of misses some of the picture, because the way the government phrases this monthly survey question is, are you working at home because of COVID? And at this point, a lot of people are no longer working from home because of COVID. They're working from home because they've been working from home and they like it better, and their companies are letting them do that. So I think we probably need more accurate ways of measuring what percent of people are working from home, because 7% is a really small part of the country, but it's not nothing. So yeah, I think that we're kind of in a little bit of a wait and see period right now, where a lot of companies are testing. If they tell people they have to come back, will people actually come back? And workers are waiting to see, like, will companies actually check their badge swipes, or, find some way of actually making sure they're coming to the office. So it's an interesting period. I think there's also probably going to be like a long tail of this, because a lot of commercial real estate leases are 10 years long. So it's going to be some time before we know, like, our office is going to give up their leases. And like, how far are they willing to go to keep them and make sure people come back?
I will ask you in conclusion then, how are you observing companies communicating? You talked about CEOs, some about employees, happiness surveys and so forth. How are you seeing companies change the way they communicate, that you can offer guidance for these students, who most of whom will be out in the business world in a couple of 3 years?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies have realized more frequent communication is really important. And I think one of the reasons for that is, like, when you're in the office, you can bump into your boss and ask a question or ask for feedback on something or what the plan for something is. But when you're working from home, you have no idea what your boss is thinking, or what's going on with the plan for your work for the week. So I think a lot of companies have gotten into habits of communicating more. And that, I think, has been really helpful to workers. I also think that they're realizing that when you can't interact with people in person, the communication has to be more thoughtful and more intentional and more kind of warm and human. Because if people are just sitting at home, logging onto their laptops and getting like completely depersonalized messages once a week from their boss, it's really hard to feel motivated to do your best work. Like, what I think a lot of companies have realized, what motivates the work isn't just the pay or the perks, it's the relationships. And when the relationships can't be formed fully in person, there just has to be a lot more intentionality put into the way bosses communicate to form those relationships.
Well, I have had my microphone muted. You've been missing out on exciting thing here. They're drilling holes in the floor upstairs. Not like we're at a desk,
No.
but you haven't been hearing it. Emma, thank you so very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to jump into our classroom, and I'll share this video with some of the folks that weren't able to be here today. But
Thank you so much for having me.
And anytime you want to come to Nebraska, I will give you a big red corn hat to wear, like
Awesome.
at the football games.
Perfect. Thank you for all the great questions.
Sure. Bye-bye. Well, Mariana, you have anything to say? You're on screen.
Yeah, that was great, Randy. So great of you to bring Emma in. She has so many great points, and I think it's such an important point, especially as we're going to continue to see where the future of work goes. I mean, even in primarily retail, right? As a director of brand, I'm still hybrid. So so I think that even goes to show that in brick and mortar, you can still have hybrid roles. It's as retail goes as well. So really, really important. She was great.
Nadine, you have anything to conclude? Any comments?
I really enjoyed listening from an expert in this field specifically, since this is the first time I've seen anyone that works in journalism, and she was really, really great, and I was really impressed by her experience. And thank you so much for letting me have this chance to be part of this meeting today.
Well, you're welcome, and it's good to see you. And Mariana, good to see you too. I hope you guys all do well, and we'll get back to our business here in the classroom. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.